The story of Oscar Wilde's life is a tragedy. The story of a man who was publicly outed as a homosexual, ostracized for it, jailed for it, and then released from prison years later to find little to no support from the people he held close in his life. All of this was aided by this book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Sure, it's a bit of an oversimplification, and we'll get into that, but this is something I think about a lot. Oscar Wilde and The Picture of Dorian Gray are my Roman Empire. On a fairly regular basis, I am reminded about the book and its impact on his life because it is emblematic of an opinion I've held for a very long time. All art is political. This is a sentiment that I don't see shared all that much. Rather, I see the exact opposite. Social media is filled to the brim with people demanding that movies and TV shows should stop being so political. Yet, that very request is antithetical to art itself. There is no such thing as non-political art. Art is a way to convey meaning oftentimes without directly stating anything. Take this artwork by Helen Wilson titled Grassland Diaries, Autumn Glory, for example. When we see a portrait like this, our immediate inclination is to interpret it. What is it that this artist is trying to convey? Works of art like this are obviously meant to invoke some sense of wonder within the viewer, maybe even some introspection as to what their personal takeaways could be. What Helen Wilson captured here is an emotion, the feeling of seeing nature. Your takeaway here could be as simple as, wow, nature is pretty badass. And you wouldn't be wrong. This might lead you to thinking, though, about my earlier point. All art is political. Yet, this one here really is just saying, if we're being pedantic about it, that nature is beautiful. It's really just a nice thing to look at. In no way does this work of art tell me to go vote for Claudia de la Cruz and become a dumpster diving freegan. I think that's a rather flippant point, though, and you likely do as well. Nature and its preservation are extremely politicized points, after all. I find that point, in and of itself, to be very telling about the nature of politics. See, politics are often the decisions that we make in legislation based entirely upon our opinions and worldviews. Politics, in its very nature, is based around our opinions. We're looking at the same things and coming away with different solutions and interpretations. Someone else could look at Grassland Diaries and say, no, this is not a display of nature in its brilliance. I hate nature, and this doesn't even resemble nature. It looks like a new James Cameron movie. Would they be wrong for this interpretation? I think many of us would hesitate to say so, yet it feels wrong. We probably want to say that this strange straw man of someone who hates nature is incorrect, but we also understand that this is the feeling evoked by the piece to that person's worldview. Ultimately, we may want to counter this interpretation with our own or, even better, with what the author's intent was. In a blog post, Helen lets us in somewhat to her thought process. I have learned that spring does not come by the calendar, and sometimes it is impossible to tell if spring has actually come. This year, after what seemed like a year-long winter, 2020, spring has arrived early on the shores of northeast Ohio. Early spring is wonderful because it is a very slow and subtle change. You notice a little color in the woods. The bird song becomes more optimistic. The sweet green of new mosses appear in the woods. Early spring requires observation and a willingness to pause. It does not force itself upon us. Within this context, we can now look at the work and consider her process. How she is trying to evoke the feeling of spring in its arrival. The skyline in the photo shows a muddy, brown sky that can relay the sloshy ground associated with this time of year. Similarly, the wet, soppy applications of paint further provide the textural feeling of stepping into a rain-smothered patch of grass. Even the grass itself, represented by pieces of paper reaching off of the page, seem weighed down compared to her other works where grass is depicted. The colors of the blades also can emphasize the rainy season by the simple change from realistic green grass to teal and even blue streaks. All of what I said is still interpretive, but based upon what Helen Wilson intended, it feels nicer than someone who disagrees with the interpretation because of the support of the author. But what about instances where people can't help but draw conclusions outside of what the author intended? Does Helen's intent usurp any dissenting interpretations of this art? A rather popular example of this is Quentin Tarantino's interpretation of the original King Kong. In a 2009 interview on NPR, he elaborates upon this stance, which was conveyed by a Nazi Gestapo major from his film Inglourious Bastards.
But that's one of the things that I love the most about when I do write film criticism and stuff is getting into the subtextual areas, and I like it when text can be explored believably in the course of a piece. I like the fact that little film comment, sight and sound piece that just breaks out of the room, and I think the when they play the celebrity game in this movie, the whole dissertation on what is underneath King Kong.
Oh, I love that.
Has one of those big moments in it, and it's interesting watching it because I've seen it now in a few different countries, that scene, and it's and to me it's very interesting. I mean, to me it's very obvious. I mean, of course King Kong is a metaphor for the slave trade. I'm not saying the makers of King Kong meant it to be that way, but that's the movie that they made, whether they meant to make it or not. To me, King Kong is a metaphor for America's fear of the black male, and to me, that's obvious. All right. So, that was one of the first things I said when I was talking to a friend of mine after he saw Peter Jackson's version of King Kong. And I said, is the racial metaphors in there? Is the racial subtext in there? And he goes, no. And I go, well, then that's just a story of a big monkey. What's that about? But I'm still shocked that a lot of people don't even look at it as that. So when the character says it in the movie, it's like there's actually I've seen shock and then applause of people realizing it for the very first time that King Kong is a metaphor for the slave trade. And I even love the fact that it's a Gestapo major,
right,
who is actually calling America on its racist past.
This is a hotly debated interpretation, and one which relies upon the death of the author. King Kong was not originally intended to be an allegory for the slave trade. But I also think it's being dismissive to suggest that there were no external social factors which may have contributed to the film, its marketing, and its reception. Once a work leaves the hands of the author and into the hands of an audience, it is certainly opening itself up to being interpreted by said audience as well. I think what is important to keep in mind here, though, is critical analysis. Infamously, the Pepe the Frog meme has been co-opted by far-right groups against the wishes of its author. Its meme status had turned a silly image of a cartoon frog into a symbol of bigotry and hatred. Matt Fury, the creator of Boys Club and Pepe the Frog, has been fighting for years to stop the hateful connotations of his work while supporting the more positive ones. The mimetic usage of Pepe in no way correlates to the character or the creative work from which he originated. He is merely a symbol, but what that symbol means is defined by those who use it. In Hong Kong, for example, Pepe is not a symbol of hatred, but rather one for liberation and freedom, akin to how Winnie the Pooh has been used similarly in protests against the Chinese government. These interpretations, though, are not critically assessing the works. They are memes, but they are further politicizing the works associated with them. If someone were to critically assess the Boys Club comic now, it would almost feel necessary to address how the character of Pepe had been stolen and misused by the far right, especially in Western circles, despite the fact that nothing within the text itself would actually support far-right ideals. So what does this actually say about art? Sure, we can say that author intent matters a great deal in instances like with Matt Fury and Boys Club. Similarly, we can also say that outside factors heavily contribute to interpretations of works of art, like with King Kong. Is the only difference here that progressive messages are better? Not exactly. After all, I do believe that Pepe the Frog's association with the far right is important. I think Matt Fury would agree with this, which is why he killed the character off. He could not ignore the fact that external factors beyond his control forever changed Pepe. So he had to kill him. It is a scary reality, I think, that many artists will have to face. Once a work enters into the public, you are opening it up to interpretation. Your work, both surface level and subtextually, will be analyzed. This is the unfortunate reality that Oscar Wilde, too, had faced. Oscar Wilde had married Constance Lloyd and had 2 children with her by the time he had published the first edition of his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In the years following, he modified the work while beginning a close friendship with Lord Alfred Douglas, who was known by the nickname of Bosie. Some may say that Wilde had actually engaged in homosexual acts prior to meeting Bosie, but it can certainly be agreed upon that Bosie was more than just an infatuation for Wilde. Oscar Wilde clearly cheated on his wife, Constance Lloyd, with Bosie. By 1892, Oscar Wilde and Bosie had found themselves amongst a group of homosexuals who had found what they referred to as renters, which were primarily teenage boys who were selling their bodies to older men. Both Wilde, who was 38 at the time, and Bosie, who was 22, regularly paid for renters as young as 16 years old. The age of consent in London at this time had just recently been increased from 13 to 16. However, this was specifically a law regarding young girls. At this time in London society, any sexual relations between men were deemed illegal, while many, such as myself, would view the sexual acts committed by Wilde and Bosie at the time to be immoral. I can say that my objections are strictly due to the gap in age between the participants and not the fact that these were homosexual relationships. Nevertheless, Wilde and Bosie made it no secret that they were seeing these renters. Victorian society had gotten word about these acts, and the gossip had reached Bosie's father, John Douglas, Marquis of Queensberry. Douglas was a conservative who, famously, had devised a new ruling system for boxing, which is still used to this day. It's why Marquis was featured in Mike Tyson Mysteries and is just a fascinating little chestnut that I feel is worth mentioning. Anyway, Douglas heard the news about his son and Wilde participating in sodomy and found it morally reprehensible. Being a conservative and an esteemed boxer, he saw fit to give Wilde a thrashing rather than, perhaps, trying to settle the dispute with words. Unfortunately for Douglas, he couldn't find Wilde at any of his usual haunts. Instead, he had to settle for leaving behind his calling card with a note attached. Unfortunately for him again, he was unable to spell the word sodomite correctly, so we can all make fun of him now for it. Great point, bozo. Too bad you can't spell. Oscar Wilde did end up receiving this note and summarily decided to sue Douglas for libel, at the behest of Bosie and against the advice of all of his close associates. The main issue here being that what Douglas actually wrote on the card wasn't incorrect. It was a known secret among high Victorian society that Wilde participated in homosexual intercourse and, importantly, paid minors for it. If Douglas were to locate any of those renters, he would have first-hand testimony from a fairly reliable witness who would be able to identify other renters, and even Wilde and Bosie's other associates who frequented the clubs where the renters sold their services. I think it is important to stop and talk a bit about The Picture of Dorian Gray, as it is relevant to the trial itself. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel that sees the titular Dorian Gray as a member of high society, who is self-obsessed but otherwise quite typical. He is young, reserved, and handsome. A friend of his, Basil Hallward, paints a portrait of Dorian stylized in such a way that evokes the admiration he has for his beauty. Basil is quite clearly attracted to Dorian, and in the original draft he even states that he has romantic feelings for him, and had never loved a woman. Although these sections were removed in the edit for obvious reasons. The subtext still remains, though, that Basil was indeed a homosexual who was infatuated with Dorian. While sitting for the painting, Dorian is exposed to the hedonistic views of Lord Henry, another companion of his. Dorian becomes obsessed with seeking out the sensual hedonism Lord Henry spoke of, and upon seeing the finished portrait of himself, he becomes enamored with it. He wishes that he could be like it, timeless, never aging, and preserving his youth and his beauty. He laments that the painting will have such a luxury while he himself will age and wither away. Dorian then goes on to court an actress, Sybil, who he intends to marry because he becomes enamored with her acting skills, in a similar vein to how he adored his own portrait. Upon seeing one poor performance of hers, however, he calls off the marriage, which results in her taking her own life. Sybil's brother, James, vows to find the lover that had scorned her and caused her to commit such a horrid act, but only knows the nickname to which she called him. Dorian is racked with guilt, but it is here that he discovers his wish for the portrait has come true. His sins have been put on the portrait itself, as it now bears a devilish sneer. He is unchanged by his acts, and still maintains his youthful vigor. It is then that he decides to lock the portrait away and spend the next 18 years pursuing debauchery in an attempt to experience every sensation possible, adhering to the sensualist hedonism Lord Henry had previously spoke of. Basil hears of Dorian's ravenous acts throughout the years, and visits Dorian only to discover that the portrait is now twisted beyond recognition. He can only identify it by his signature, which was painted in the corner, exactly the same as he initially scrawled. Repulsed, he tries to reason with Dorian and ends up becoming another victim of his, as Dorian is so overcome with emotion and rage that he stabs Basil to death. Even more years pass, with Dorian delving further into depravity without aging. While he is on a hunting trip with Lord Henry, one of the hunters accidentally shoots James, who had discovered Dorian's identity and was plotting to murder him. After this, Dorian decides to attempt to live righteously, but discovers that his moral efforts are in vain, as his portrait only grows all the viler. He realizes his attempts to live a better life have been out of his own self-interest to fix the portrait, so the portrait only worsened. Seeing no alternative, he stabs the portrait with the same knife he had used to kill Basil. His servants hear a scream from the attic where he keeps the portrait, and discover his body, now decrepit and unrecognizable, a knife sticking out of his chest, and the portrait beside him, which looks exactly as how Basil first painted it. Now, Lord Henry, Dorian, and especially Basil are all implied to have engaged in homosexual acts, if not having romantic feelings toward other men. It was a criticism of the novel when it was first published, as many found that fact alone to be far too debaucherous, despite its relevance to the text. Oscar Wilde, of course, openly rejected these reviews. In one of his written responses, he stated, "I am quite incapable of understanding how any work of art can be criticized from a moral standpoint. The sphere of art and the sphere of ethics are absolutely distinct and separate." You see, Oscar Wilde was an aestheticist, someone who believed that art should exist for art's sake. In response to another review, Wilde wrote, "From an aesthetic point of view, it would be difficult to keep the moral in its proper secondary place, and even now I do not feel quite sure that I have been able to do so. I think the moral too apparent. When the book is published in a volume, I hope to correct this defect." The idea of a man selling his soul for hedonistic pleasure was nothing new, and this story had the obvious moral that blind, unadulterated hedonism was grossly immoral. It is a moral that is almost intrinsic to this kind of story. The Picture of Dorian Gray, to Wilde, was just a story of a man who was obsessed with the intangible meaning behind a painting of himself, and brought to destruction because of it. There is more than one moral within the book, though, namely the moral of aestheticism. This is something I've always found immensely ironic. Oscar Wilde had written a novel with the moral that we should not be looking to art to seek out morals. It was paradoxical by nature. If Oscar Wilde and I were both looking at one of Helen Wilson's works, he would strictly admire it for its artistic merits and the emotions it expresses rather than trying to find within it some deeper meaning. It would either be a good work of art or a bad work of art. To him, he would agree to the point that King Kong is really just a movie about a big monkey. Art is meant to entertain, and any sort of moral derived from it is mere happenstance. It's quite telling that his novel, which unabashedly includes allegorical morals, is one that he wanted to downplay the moralizing of, if not outright remove it. I quite honestly have no idea how he intended to correct the defect of his novel, including a moral, when the purpose of the narrative itself necessitates there being one. It is a rather strange instance of the death of the author that still fascinates me every time I think about it. It is a battle between intent and interpretation I haven't really seen anywhere else. So, how is this used against him? After all, this was Wilde suing Douglas for libel and claiming that he was a sodomite. Wouldn't it just be far more convincing to acquire witnesses and direct ties from Wilde to the homosexual underground in contemporary London? Absolutely. But we also have to understand that this was not just some ordinary libel trial. This was a trial with a level of public attention akin to the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. Douglas wanted to put Wilde on blast, for lack of a better term, and completely ruin his reputation. Douglas's defense was, of course, required to provide their documented findings to prove that Wilde posed as a sodomite, and the majority of the evidence compiled included the literary works and writings of Oscar Wilde. They also were unaware that many of the renters with whom Wilde frequented were listed, but going into the trial they were unaware of the extent to which the defense had made contact with them. For some odd reason, they were going in with the optimistic hope that the renters would be loyal to Wilde, and their names being listed as evidence was primarily there to get a rise out of him. Seeing as Oscar Wilde's writing was such a large part of the case against him, the majority of it according to the disclosure, his prosecution saw it fit to provide 2 letters of their own into the court record. Letters which Wilde wrote to Bosie, perhaps the most incriminating of which read, "My own boy, your sonnet is quite lovely, and it is a marvel that those red rose-leaf lips of yours should have been made no less for music of song than for madness of kissing. Your slim gilt soul walks between passion and poetry. I think Hyacinthus, whom Apollo loved so madly, was you in Greek days. Why are you in London? And when do you go to Salisbury? Do go there, and cool your hands in the grey twilight of Gothic things, and come here whenever you like. It is a lovely place. It only lacks you. But go to Salisbury first. Always with undying love, yours, Oscar." Like, holy shit, dude. I'm sorry for swearing here, but even by today's standards, this is some of the most unapologetically homoerotic letter writing I have ever seen in my entire life. I would rather kiss every man present in that courtroom to prove my alleged heterosexuality than reveal something this intimate. Keep in mind that this was presented in 1895 London, where, again, any act of homosexuality was deemed not only immoral, but entirely illegal. Nonetheless, Wilde intended to beat the allegations against him by playing this hand, which I actually could respect. See, Wilde, being an aestheticist, argued that this letter held artistic merits. They were works of art written to his close companion. There was no deeper meaning behind them. His lawyer, Sir Edward Clarke, tried to play up Wilde's flowery use of language and insinuate that the cultural gap between him and the common layperson was rather large. Wilde was an artist who was so esteemed that he was beyond interpretation of his own works. Even his private letters, which otherwise may seem like extremely blatant examples of his romantic feelings towards other men, were works of art. Douglas's lawyer, Edward Carson, Queen's Counsel, responded to this by presenting the Picture of Dorian Gray as evidence, specifically when Lord Henry boasts about his debaucherous hedonism and sensualism to Dorian, who Carson referred to as an innocent young man. Wilde, true to his fashion, clapped back hard and was actually gaining favor with those in attendance at the trial. Wilde insisted that art was not moral or immoral, but rather either well made or poorly made. and the world of interpretation was for brutes and illiterates. However, while Wilde was winning over the crowd, Carson was truly winning the legal case. This was especially true once they had finished presenting Wilde's literary works, where he could dismiss the admittedly obvious interpretations into his actual actions. The first prominent point was that Wilde was caught lying about his age under oath. Even worse, however, was when Wilde was pressed on his relationships with the young men at his most frequent haunt. Wilde insisted that, although he was rather generous in showing them affection through purchasing lavish gifts for them, his relationship with them by no means was either romantic, nor was it sexual. A bombshell was then dropped on Wilde. The defense had actually obtained several renters who were present at the courthouse, ready to testify against him on that very day. These renters, for the most part, were willing to testify specifically because their services also meant that they were guilty of sodomy just like Wilde. They had been threatened to also be charged as sodomites unless they testified against him, and many of them agreed. There was no option left. Wilde could not allow the renters to speak and legally establish him as a sodomite. He dropped the charges, and that same day, a warrant for his arrest was made. Carson's investigation had utilized government officials who wouldn't turn a blind eye to all the evidence they had compiled against Wilde. Those close to him, who urged him not to sue Douglas for libel, had already suggested that he flee to France, and did so again. However, Wilde noted that now it was too late. He remained in London, and not long after he was arrested for the crime of sodomy. Meanwhile, those same companions themselves fled to France alongside Bosie, who took a great deal of persuasion to leave, as he wanted to stay and try to help Wilde fight against the accusations against him. What helped convince Bosie to leave was that he would be of little help to Wilde in his trial, and, if anything, would only work against his plea of not guilty. During Wilde's sodomy trial, a poem written by Bosie, titled Two Loves, that was featured in a literary magazine from several years prior, was read, and it reads as follows. Sweet youth, tell me why, sad and sighing, dost thou rove these pleasant realms? I pray thee tell me sooth, what is thy name? He said, my name is Love. Then straight the first did turn himself to me, and cried, he lieth, for his name is Shame. But I am Love, and I was wont to be alone in this fair garden, till he came, unasked by night. I am true Love, I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame. Then sighing said the other, have thy will. I am the love that dare not speak its name. Wilde was asked specifically what the last line of the poem meant. I am the love that dare not speak its name. Pausing for a few moments, Wilde then stated, the love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep, spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century so misunderstood, so much misunderstood, that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on account of it I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man. When the elder man has intellect, and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it. Upon hearing that, we may read this as perhaps the most damnable thing Wilde could possibly have said. Although it is worth noting that many in attendance of the trial cheered at his interpretation, while others did admittedly hiss. The judge apparently had to silence the courtroom at this point. Being a criminal trial, it featured a jury who had been so swayed by Wilde's wit and poetic language that they could not come to a consensus. Another final trial was held where he was convicted on charges of sodomy and sentenced to hard labor from 1895 to 1897. The first prison he was sent to had prisoners walking treadmills and picking apart old ropes. The only reading he was permitted was the Holy Bible and The Pilgrim's Progress. He was later transferred to another prison where he was also worked extensively, their motto being hard labor, hard fare, and a hard bed. It was there that the hard labor had taken a toll on him and he collapsed while in the prison's chapel, which ruptured one of his eardrums and would later be an associated cause of his death. Eventually, in late 1895, only a few months into his sentencing, he was transferred to his third and final prison where he would be permitted access to pen and paper, as well as receive fairer treatment than his other two facilities. Here he wrote a 50,000-word letter to Bosie, reflecting on their relationship, his own career, and his possible redemption. In this letter, he wrote that his addiction to Bosie had resulted in his own downfall, and that the both of them were rather poor influences on each other. He seems rather regretful about their time spent together, and upon release from prison, he prepared to send the letter to Bosie through a mutual party. Bosie never admitted to receiving this letter. Once Wilde was released, he only had 3 years left to live. For some months, he stayed with his companion Robert Ross, who he entrusted the delivery of his letter to Bosie. And later, he even lived in northern France with Bosie, against the wishes of both of their families. Constance Lloyd refused to see Wilde or allow him access to their children, but did allow him an allowance of sorts, what amounted to approximately just over $400 American per week in today's currency. But she threatened to revoke his allowance if Wilde continued boarding with Bosie. Bosie's family, too, threatened to cut him off if he continued living with Wilde. The two amicably split. The remainder of Wilde's life, at this point just over 2 short years, was spent alone, living out in a hotel in Paris. He was publicly shamed despite publishing one final successful work in which he detailed the hanging of a man in the third prison in which he stayed. Wilde was no longer the socialite he was once and became destitute, suffering alcoholism and being shamed into isolation. He had tried to be received into the Catholic Church but was initially denied. It wasn't until he was on his deathbed that he was conditionally baptized into the church. He died November 30th, 1900 of meningitis. Recently, in 2017, he was pardoned for his crimes of homosexuality under the Alan Turing law. The story of Oscar Wilde is that of a tragedy, but it is one that remains so human to me. Sure, we can have extensive conversation regarding the ethics of his relationships, given the fact that he was compensating what we would consider to be minors today. But in contemporary laws in London, they would have been legal adults, if not for being boys. I personally can appreciate the nuance of that, but still personally hold his actions to be objectionable on the sole basis of their power imbalance. However, I do find that his treatment was undeserved given the rationale behind their decision-making. Regardless of the morals behind the age gaps between him and his sexual partners, I still find this to be a rather sad yet interesting case and can't help but think about it anytime someone demands that entertainment be solely entertaining. Oscar Wilde was a man who so fervently believed in the ideals of aestheticism that he was willing to take them into a court of law, staking his freedom and, in a way, even his life on that notion. My ultimate point here is that when we look at the writings of Oscar Wilde, we can quite plainly see the obvious intent behind them as well as their conveyed meaning, despite his protests that there wasn't any deeper meaning behind his words, that they were simply words to which he applied meaning unnecessarily, is quite paradoxical, and I think the majority of people should see and understand that. However, I feel that even though people can clearly see what Wilde's works meant and conveyed, they still aren't exactly able to translate that understanding to contemporary media. I've seen a lot of discussions regarding media literacy online, and I do have to say that I think there is a disconnect there. The most prominent example of which I can think of is how Star Wars, from its very inception, has been a critique of American imperialism, and the prequel films were a critique of American politics itself. Yet these are points which have clearly gone over many people's heads. There is a pushback to interpreting films, books, TV shows, and even music, seemingly because there is a large group of people who share Wilde's paradoxical views. Either that, or, what I feel is much more likely the case, they simply just don't care about the deeper meaning of media they consume. Although, on a positive note, I do feel as though this is a rather fringe stance and is typically met with appropriate criticism. Humans, by our very nature, are meaning makers. We love to craft stories and share them with one another and use them to express our views, which I think is a wonderful thing. Because of this, I feel it important to try to encourage and develop exploration of themes and meanings when consuming any work. I'd say that subconsciously everybody does it. It's just the discussion itself which I feel needs to be had more. When next listening to a song, or watching a movie, or playing a video game, I would encourage you to take some time to think about what it means to you. Try to think about what the authors are trying to convey. Perhaps even research it for yourself to see what it is they are meaning to say. Do you agree with that message? How well do you feel the message was portrayed by the work? Maybe you could even constructively think about how their work could be improved to better deliver that message. I would like to say, in closing, that I am not trying to state that Oscar Wilde wasn't intelligent, nor am I trying to say that I am smarter than he was. Ultimately, we disagree on the pervasive political qualities that art has, but in no way do I feel that makes either one of us superior to the other. I am interested, however, in hearing what others have to say, not only about Oscar Wilde and his tragic story, but also their own opinions regarding art and its political nature. I'm especially interested in hearing about interpretations that others have found especially impactful in the art that they've consumed, and I encourage for you to put them in the comments below. Thank you for giving me your time, and subscribe if you'd like to listen to me ramble more about my other Roman empires. I am, as stated before, a rather opinionated person who loves to try and delve into media and have a lot to talk about it. Anyway, thank you again, and goodbye.